The air on the plane felt dense, like something heavy was hovering just beneath the surface. The hum of the engines mixed with the soft chatter of passengers finding their seats. But for Michaela, something was off from the start. She could feel it in the way the flight attendants were moving, furtive glances, hushed conversations. She had learned to recognize these subtle cues over the years, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why it was happening now. As she settled into her window seat, Michaela tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been growing since the moment she boarded. She was on her way to a crucial business meeting in New York, and everything had to go perfectly. The presentation she'd worked on for months was ready, her research was flawless, and her career depended on this trip. She pulled her blazer tighter around her shoulders and checked the time. Only a few more minutes until takeoff. The rain outside streaked across the window in thin lines, giving the sky a gray, almost foreboding hue. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the jittery nerves that had nothing to do with the presentation, but everything to do with what was about to unfold. Then, just as the last few passengers were taking their seats, Michaela felt a soft tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a flight attendant standing beside her face tight with a forced smile. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice low but polite. "But we've had an issue with the seat assignments. We've double-booked some of the business class seats, and we'd like to ask you to move to the back of the plane." Michaela blinked, a feeling of disbelief creeping in. "Excuse me? You're asking me to give up my seat?" The attendant nodded, her eyes flicking nervously to the seat number above Michaela's head, then quickly down to the clipboard in her hands. "We're offering you another seat in economy, and we'll make sure you're taken care of with a complimentary drink." Michaela's gaze shifted to the empty seat the attendant was pointing to in the back. A man stood there, tall and well-dressed, with a look on his face that suggested he was more than entitled to the front row. His eyes were already scanning the room, barely acknowledging Michaela as he fiddled with his phone. The flight attendant's politeness felt too practiced, too rehearsed, as though she were reciting a line. Michaela's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what was happening. It was the subtle microaggressions, the type of thing that had followed her throughout her career, the constant feeling of being overlooked, undermined, pushed aside. "I paid for this seat," Michaela said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm not moving." The attendant's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure. "We're really sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am, but if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate the situation." Michaela could feel the weight of the eyes around her, some passengers staring openly, others pretending to read or look out the window, but she knew they were all watching. She had been here before, many times. A sudden realization hit her. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. She looked the attendant in the eye, unwavering. "I'm not moving. You can talk to the supervisor if you need to." As the attendant walked away, Michaela's mind raced. What just happened? She couldn't believe this was happening. But as the plane slowly filled with passengers, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this slide. Michaela's heart was pounding, but she held her ground. The flight attendant disappeared down the aisle, leaving Michaela with a knot in her stomach. The feeling of being singled out wasn't new, but this situation felt different, more deliberate. She glanced at the man in the front row again. He hadn't moved, still looking at his phone with that smug indifference that seemed to scream entitlement. There was a faint flicker of recognition on his face when he saw her look back, but it quickly vanished, replaced by that same aloof expression. Michaela's stomach churned. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she considered her options. She could quietly comply, avoid making a scene, and pretend that everything was fine. That was the path she had taken so many times before, keeping her head down, keeping the peace, making sure no one thought she was a troublemaker. But today, something felt different. Her thoughts kept drifting to her daughter, Ella, who was waiting for her back home. Michaela had spent so many years working late, traveling for business, missing out on moments with her daughter. She had told herself it was all for the greater good, for their future. But this moment, felt like the line she wasn't willing to cross anymore. As the minutes ticked by, Michaela's unease grew. The stewardess returned, this time with a supervisor, a man with a neatly pressed uniform and an expression that could have been carved from stone. He leaned down close to Michaela, his voice low and carefully controlled. Ma'am, we've already offered you a solution, but we really need your cooperation, he said. If you don't comply, we may have to remove you from the flight. Michaela didn't flinch. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, but this time she wasn't backing down. I paid for this seat, she said, her voice steady, but her hands were still clenched. Why don't you ask him to move? I'm not the one with the upgraded ticket. The supervisor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Michaela could see a flicker of frustration. He straightened up, clearly taken aback. It's not about that, ma'am. This gentleman is a frequent flyer, and he has priority seating. Michaela's jaw clenched. I paid for my seat, too, she said firmly. There's no reason for me to move. The supervisor hesitated, then gestured toward the flight attendants who were now standing by, waiting for his command. Michaela could see the faint trace of impatience in their eyes, but she didn't back down. She was done being polite, done being quiet, done letting people walk all over her just to keep the peace. I'm not moving, she repeated, her voice unwavering. I'm not going to let you push me around. The supervisor's face grew cold, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the two security officers who had just entered the cabin. Michaela's stomach dropped. The large men, stoic and imposing, didn't speak as they walked toward her. But their presence was enough to make the other passengers in the cabin sit up a little straighter. Michaela felt the weight of their gazes, but she refused to let them intimidate her. She had made her decision. This wasn't about a seat on a plane. It was about something far more important. The silence in the cabin felt suffocating as the two security officers approached Michaela. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the aisle, and every pair of eyes in the plane seemed to be following their movement. Michaela could feel the tension building around her, a quiet storm about to break. The officers were not just here to escort her off the plane. They were here to enforce what the airline wanted, and she was the obstacle. One of the officers leaned in, his voice low but firm. Ma'am, we need you to step off the plane. Michaela's heart raced, but her mind was clear. She had been preparing herself for this moment since the flight attendant first tapped her shoulder. This wasn't about a seat. This was about something much larger than her, about standing up for herself, her dignity, and the countless times she had let things slide just to avoid conflict. For a moment, she considered the consequences. Her meeting in New York, the one that could define her career, was slipping further and further from her reach with each passing second. She thought about Ella, how disappointed her daughter would be if she didn't make it back in time to help with the school play. But as Michaela stood gathering her things and preparing to face the inevitable, she thought of something else, her mother's voice echoing in her head. You don't let people push you around, Michaela. Never let them think they can walk all over you. Her mother had always been the one to remind her to fight for what was right, even when the fight seemed impossible. Michaela stood up slowly, her legs shaky but steady. She grabbed her carry-on bag from under the seat and turned to face the security officers, her shoulders squared. I'm leaving, she said, trying to steady her breath, but I won't be silenced. The officers didn't respond, but their presence seemed to grow even more imposing as she made her way down the aisle. Michaela felt a wave of heat rush to her face, but she refused to let herself break down. She wasn't just walking off a plane. She was making a statement that she wouldn't let anyone diminish her worth, no matter how inconvenient it was for them. As she reached the plane door, Michaela turned one last time to look at the passengers. Some of them avoided her gaze, but a few nodded, as if they understood what she was doing. It was a small moment of solidarity, but it made her feel a little less alone. The flight attendants were still standing near the back, their faces a mix of frustration and disbelief. But Michaela didn't care anymore. She walked off that plane with her head held high. Michaela stepped off the plane, her stomach a swirl of emotions, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She'd left the gate agent, the flight attendants, and the silent passengers behind. But the weight of the moment, of what she had just done, lingered in the air around her. She had no idea what was next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let them sweep this under the rug. Not this time. As she walked toward the terminal, the hum of the airport felt louder than usual. Every footstep seemed to echo in her mind, a reminder of what had just happened. The security officers followed behind her, their heavy boots reverberating with the same rhythm. They didn't speak, but their presence was unmistakable. Michaela's thoughts raced. What would happen next? Would they press charges? Would they blacklist her from flying with that airline again? What about her career? But those questions didn't matter right now. What mattered was standing up for herself. She wasn't going to let this moment define her in a negative way. She'd fought for years to get to this point in her career. The last thing she would do was let some airline mishandle her like she was disposable. She glanced at her phone. There were several missed calls from her assistant, but Michaela couldn't bring herself to pick up just yet. She wasn't ready for another round of explaining what had happened, or worse, offering some kind of apology. There was nothing to apologize for. Michaela made her way to a quiet corner of the terminal, away from the busy crowd. She leaned against the cold, hard wall, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to calm herself. For a moment, she considered calling her lawyer, but she hesitated. There were too many unknowns right now. Was this the right time to escalate things, or was she just emotionally charged from the confrontation? Her phone buzzed again, this time a text from her colleague, Tasha. "You good? Heard what happened. Let me know if you need anything. This isn't over." Michaela stared at the screen for a moment before typing a quick response. "I'm fine. I'm handling it." But even as she typed those words, Michaela knew that the situation wasn't something that could just be handled quietly. She had made a decision, and it was bigger than just a seat on a plane. It was about standing up for herself and anyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. She wasn't going to be pushed into submission, not anymore. A few minutes later, another text came through, this one from her boss. "Michaela, I need to talk to you. Corporate is getting word of the incident. They're freaking out." Her stomach dropped. The weight of what had happened was starting to sink in. She had no idea what kind of fallout this would have on her company or her relationship with the airline. She rubbed her temples, trying to ground herself. No matter what, she had to stay calm. She couldn't let this moment get the best of her. She had made the right choice. Michaela stood up, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just a fight for a seat. This was a fight for respect, for dignity, and for the right to be heard. And she wasn't going to back down, not now, not ever. As she walked toward the airport lounge to find a place to sit and figure out her next move, Michaela knew she had to be ready for whatever came next. She had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. Michaela sat down in a quiet corner of the airport lounge, her legs still shaky from the confrontation. She didn't want to think about the ripple effect of her actions just yet. Instead, she focused on her phone, staring at the screen as she saw the same message pop up over and over. Texts from Tasha, emails from her assistant, even a few more from her boss. They were all asking the same thing. "Are you okay?" Her mind was still racing, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense that she had just set something in motion. The phone buzzed again. It was from her lawyer, Alicia, the woman who had always advised her on matters of business law, but it wasn't just business she needed advice on now. She opened the message. "I saw the video. This could escalate quickly. Let's talk ASAP." Michaela took a deep breath, then hit the dial button. As the phone rang, she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her thoughts. She didn't want to hear the chaos that had already begun to swirl around her, but she knew it was only a matter of time before everything would spiral out of control. "Hey, Michaela, I saw it. I'm not going to lie, it's a big deal." Alicia's voice was steady, but Michaela could hear the underlying concern. "But you did the right thing." "I don't know. I'm not sure anymore. This is big," Michaela said, her voice cracking just a little. "I didn't expect it to blow up like this." "That's the thing," Alicia responded. "You've got people paying attention now, and they want to see what you do next. This is a pivotal moment for you, Michaela. It's not just about the airline anymore. It's about what you stand for. And trust me, people respect that. They respect strength." Michaela nodded, even though Alicia couldn't see her. Strength. It was a word she had heard often in the past few years, but hearing it now, in the context of what had just happened, made her feel something different. It felt like a call to action, like the moment she had been waiting for without even knowing it. "I don't know if I can handle all this fallout," Michaela admitted, her voice softer now. "Corporate's going crazy. They want to talk about damage control. I don't even know where to start." Alicia paused, taking in what Michaela had said. "Listen, what's happening with the airline is just the beginning. You're about to get some serious media attention, Michaela, and with that comes a lot of power, but also a lot of responsibility. You need to decide if you want to push back or let it go, and if you choose to push back, I'm here to help." Michaela sat in silence for a long moment. She looked around the lounge, her mind flashing back to the moment on the plane when the stewardess had asked her to move. The man's indifferent face, the supervisor's cold expression, the security officers looming nearby. She had stood her ground then, but now the weight of the decision settled heavily on her shoulders. "I'm not backing down," Michaela said finally, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't just about the flight anymore. I can't be silent about this. It's bigger than me." Alicia gave a low chuckle. "That's the Michaela I know. Good. Now let's start putting a plan in place. We'll handle the legal side, but you need to start thinking about how you want to approach this in the media." As Michaela hung up, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but the pieces were falling into place. The fight was no longer just about a seat on a plane. It was about something larger, something more important. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away. It was time to take control of the narrative, even if she had to drag everyone along with her. She stood up, gathering her things. Michaela wasn't sure how this would all unfold, but she knew one thing. She was in the driver's seat now, and she wasn't going to let anyone take her off course. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and endless meetings. Michaela barely had time to eat or sleep as the media storm continued to grow. Every news outlet from local stations to national networks were covering the story, and her phone was bombarded with messages. Some were supportive, messages from colleagues, friends, even strangers who had seen the video and cheered her on. Others were less kind, filled with judgment or thinly veiled threats. The tension in the air was palpable, and Michaela could feel it in her bones. She was no longer just fighting for her own dignity. She was now fighting a system that seemed intent on squashing her at every turn. Her boss had called several times, each conversation more tense than the last. Michaela could hear the stress in his voice, even though he tried to keep it under control. They were concerned about the damage to the company's reputation and how the viral video might affect their upcoming events. It was clear that the airline was trying to downplay the incident, spinning it as a simple misunderstanding. But Michaela wasn't buying it. She'd already decided that there would be no backtracking. She wasn't going to sit idly by and let them sweep this under the rug. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. They weren't going to get away with this. Not this time. That afternoon, Michaela sat in her office, reviewing the legal documents Alicia had sent over. She'd spent hours reading through everything, trying to understand the ins and outs of what was at stake. But even as she absorbed the legal jargon, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was about something bigger than just the airline or her job. It was about her place in the world. It was about being seen, being heard, and standing her ground against those who had tried to silence her. She glanced at her phone, her heart sinking as she saw the latest notification. It was a message from Tasha. "I saw the latest interview from the airline. They're still trying to paint you as the problem. It's time to fight back. We need to turn the tables." Michaela exhaled slowly. Tasha was right. The airline was trying to minimize the situation, casting doubt on her version of events. They had even implied that Michaela had been difficult or unreasonable. The nerve. Michaela had had enough of their manipulation. It was time to take control of the story, and not just through legal means. She had to speak out publicly and let people know exactly what had happened. It was time for the world to hear her side of the story, in her own words. She immediately called Alicia. "We need to release a statement, and we need to do it fast. I'm done letting them twist this." "I figured you'd say that," Alicia replied. "But be careful. Once you go public, there's no going back. The media will dissect everything you say." Michaela didn't hesitate. "I'm ready. I don't care what they say anymore. I'm not going to let them control this narrative. It's my story, and I'm telling it." Alicia was quiet for a moment, then spoke with a note of approval in her voice. "All right, let's make sure we're ready. We'll need to hit all the right points. Make sure you're clear, calm, and confident. You've got one shot at this." Michaela nodded. Though Alicia couldn't see her, her mind was already racing, formulating the message she wanted to send. This wasn't just about defending herself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been overlooked or mistreated. She wasn't going to let this be just another story that faded away. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. That evening, Michaela sat in front of her camera, a small tripod set up on the desk before her. She had never done something like this before, and the weight of it hit her all at once. Her palms were slightly sweaty, her heart thudding in her chest, but she knew this was the moment she had to own. Taking a deep breath, Michaela began. She spoke directly into the lens, her voice steady, but filled with conviction. "My name is Michaela Jennings. Recently, I was asked to leave my seat on a flight despite having paid for it in advance. I was told to move so that a man, a frequent flyer, could take my place. What happened to me wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was discrimination. I was singled out, treated as less than, all because of the way I looked. Her words were firm, and though her heart raced, she felt a strange sense of peace in knowing she was finally speaking her truth. The words spilled out, each one heavier than the last, but they felt like the right thing to say. Michaela paused, gathering her thoughts. I'm not here to attack anyone, but I am here to say that what happened on that plane shouldn't happen to anyone. It's time we started holding companies accountable, especially when they try to hide behind excuses. She finished the video, her finger hovering over the post button. For a long moment, she sat there, unsure of whether she was ready for the world to hear her story. But then, she pressed it. The world was about to see what she had gone through. The video went viral within hours. Michaela couldn't believe how quickly it spread. Notifications pinged nonstop. Her social media accounts were flooded with messages, and the media outlets picked it up faster than she could track. At first, there was a surge of support. People from all over the world commented, shared, and praised her for speaking out. But then the backlash came. It always did. Some accused her of seeking attention. Others claimed she was exaggerating or even lying. The comments were sharp, biting, and often downright nasty. But Michaela didn't look at the negative. She couldn't afford to. She had made a choice, and now she was sticking to it. Every ounce of her energy was focused on one thing, pushing back against the airline. She'd made her statement, and now she had to make sure it wasn't just another viral video that faded into obscurity. The calls kept coming. Her lawyer, Alicia, was on the line constantly, making sure everything was handled carefully. They're scrambling, Alicia said one evening. The airline is doing everything they can to quiet this down, but you've got them on the defensive. The more pressure we apply, the more cracks are going to show in their story. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about a pattern of behavior. Michaela felt a rush of determination at Alicia's words. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like the world was simply happening to her. She felt like she was in control, carving her own path through the mess. As the days passed, the news coverage grew. People were paying attention now, and Michaela knew that this wasn't just a battle she was fighting for herself. It was for every person who had ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or oppressed. It was for every passenger who had ever been told to move so someone else could have their seat. Michaela wasn't just a businesswoman fighting for her dignity anymore. She was a symbol of resistance. Her phone rang again. It was her boss, Mark. Look, Michaela, Mark said, his voice tight. We need to talk. Corporate's nervous. They're thinking of pulling the sponsorship deal with the airline. I don't know how this is going to affect the company's image. We need to consider all the angles here. Michaela bit her lip, but her voice didn't waver. I understand, but this isn't about just business anymore. If the airline gets away with this, what does that say about us? About everything we claim to stand for? There was silence on the other end, a long pause that stretched out between them. Finally, Mark spoke, though his tone had shifted softer now. I know, but you need to be careful. This is getting bigger than we anticipated. People are watching. Michaela took a deep breath. People should be watching. This needs to change. And I'm not backing down. The weight of what she was saying hit her like a wave, but she stood firm. She couldn't let the airline or anyone else dictate her narrative anymore. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all of the invisible voices that had been silenced for too long. She ended the call and sat back in her chair, her mind swirling with the implications of everything that was unfolding. The battle was far from over, but she was ready. She had taken the first step by sharing her truth, and now she was going to make sure it counted. Later that night, Michaela sat in front of her computer, drafting a press release. The tone was strong, yet measured, calm, but resolute. She wasn't going to let this slip into the realm of scandal or petty drama. This was about accountability, about standing up against injustice, and making sure that the world knew the truth. The press release hit the wire early the next morning, and by the time Michaela was getting ready for work, the calls from the media started flooding in. It was clear that the fight was just beginning, but for the first time since the incident, Michaela felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. This wasn't just a fight for her dignity. It was a fight for everyone who had been told to move aside. She wasn't done yet, and she wasn't going to back down.